Welcome back, folks, to episode 15 of the Running Man Self-Regulation and Self-Improvement Project podcast with your host, me, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology and also licensed professional counselor and an adjunct professor at our local community college. So what we're going to be talking about today is gist processing. Gist processing is something that is not involving necessarily the verbiage of getting the gist of an idea or spoken language, but rather the gist of an environmental situation in the sense of what's presenting in our vision, our visual field, and how we interpret that. And if we remember back whenever I mentioned in the first few episodes that the speed of visual processing is incredibly fast before it ever splits off and gets to our higher cognitive prefrontal cortex processes, where we start making sense of stuff and narratives and naming and labeling, which that part, the PFC, comes on at a 1.2 second range, which is fast, but in comparison to the visual processing, the perceptual speed, it's 400 times too slow if you need to make a critical decision with that. So at the perceptual level, where we start seeing what would be considered the approach avoid, most basic black white on off type of response. It's not reasoning, it's proto think, if you will. It's actually primordial think, in that it is older than the stick. Paleo would indicate that we are somehow tool makers and thinking and using whatever we have at hand, whether it be a stick or a stone, that sort of thing. Whereas primordial means that it's endogenous and within us and much older than our capacity to think, making tools. So with that reasoning, we'll discuss gist processing. Whenever we see, and this can be is a visual image in this example, uh, we're going to interpret what it is and determine whether or not we're going to act on that. Now, there was a study done, it was probably about 2010, and there have been many studies that have come after the fact and neuroimaging to support this. But the term gist processing was used whenever they did an experiment. It was a rather simple experiment they did at a college. And what they wound up doing is getting a 1 by 1 inch black and white photo with an amalgam of what seemed to be a neutral androgynous picture that could have been male or female, didn't indicate sex role, anything, dimorphism in the sense of morphology or shape, but 1 by 1, black and white, kind of like the FBI uses to do a composite photo whenever someone gives a description. And they had it stuck to I think it was a chalkboard or a whiteboard, but at a distance of about 25 feet from the portal of a door entering into the classroom where they were doing the study. But from the doorway, you could see clearly where that picture was posted, but from the doorway at 25 feet, even someone with 20/20 vision, and I used to work as an optician for years, 20/20 at 25 feet at a 1 by 1 inch black and white, you cannot make out detail. You don't have that kind of acuity unless you have eagle eyes, and that's beyond 2015, and that's superior vision. So, average person, whenever they would step the subjects up to the door, they would not let them enter, but rather they would tell them to look and report. And could they tell them what they were seeing? And most of them could not tell them what it was they were looking at, but they could see the target shape, the black and white-ish, grayish at that distance target. And whenever the composite photo had a neutral Mona Lisa type smile, just literally a little straight line of lips, nothing open, no long hair indicating hair, just kind of like a short, almost a buzz cut in the picture, but not anything that could be differentiated at 25 feet. Uh, when it was just the neutral, people physically started leaning in. They were at the line at 25 feet, told not to step forward. And of course, the experimenters were taking the report and observing them, noted that with this neutral Mona Lisa smile, that they were moving, leaning forward. They weren't walking, but rather their body was shifting in the direction of the picture. And they started commenting. They started making narrative based on the presentation of that visual picture, which was slow. It wasn't incredibly fast. And they started saying things that were positive. I feel good, or warm, positive feelings, feeling happy, this sort of stuff, while they were leaning forward. They had the same subjects come back after they had changed the picture. This time the picture was exactly the same, except for the Mona Lisa smile being changed to one that would look like the emoji that's got the anxious baring teeth. Um, so the teeth were shown, but it wasn't aggressive. It was just the teeth, the front teeth shown. And it was an open mouth, just teeth shown through the lips. And the people were asked to do the same thing 25 feet at a distance. Can you see that? Of course, they couldn't differentiate detail. They couldn't even see the fact that it had a smile. But they started leaning backwards one at a time. And these were things that were noted. And they were saying things like having bad feelings or negative or feeling upset and not comfortable. So at the level that their body was responding, it was wavering away in this case with the baring teeth picture versus wavering forward with the Mona Lisa smile. And they were saying things once the signal split off and they started thinking about it, adding words to describe very deep gut feeling things that otherwise they would have in a rational or reasonable person's explanation no external stimulus environmentally that would cause them to have such feelings or thoughts that they would describe that way. There wasn't anyone saying anything to them. There wasn't anyone suggesting anything to them. It was the environmental suggestion of them having looked in that direction, and one was neutral and the other one looked like it was baring teeth. They studied this and rationalized that they had found that they were processing at the gist level. They could tell the difference in their environment. And this is a very subtle neurological thing. This is something that you can differentiate up close, and this part of it, the gist processing part of it, happens so quick that you probably can't tell the difference. In this instance, they were actually able to separate it from something that happens much more quickly in a social setting. What's incredible is the fact that the response in the body happened before the words of description ever started happening, which stands to reason the way that we know that the brain is structured, that we perceive at the lower level of the brain, signal splits off, and then it goes to the higher cortex, and we make reasoning with it. So why is just processing so important relative to this podcast's idea of self-regulation skills and self-improvement? How is this helpful? Well, it's helpful in this sense if we're aware of the fact that things happen that quickly, that are pre-conscious, not unconscious, in the sense that we aren't aware. Our body's aware. But we do something with a signal shortly thereafter the fact, at the conscious level, we start making words and reasoning and narrative about to make sense of so we can organize it. Our brain doesn't like ambiguity. It does not like the unknown. Unknowns and ambiguities are uncomfortable, and they induce feelings of worry, anxiety, especially if we're in a situation that could be potentially harmful to us. We have to be able to make sense and categorize, and once we get to categorical thinking, it's not a huge improvement whenever it becomes judgmental, but sometimes we have to judge things good, bad, safe, not safe. And in the survival sense, it's important to know how fast this starts. And it starts at a level before we can even start making words, at the wordless level of mind, which in itself is a very profound thing. Once again, back to the question, why is this important? Well, often, whenever we have, for instance, little ones are so cool. I like kids. I love babies. I like to see them whenever they start crawling and walking and start to explore their world, because we're really not so far from that. Often we may have harsh experiences growing up, but they teach us stuff. But in that sense of exploration, not that children are fearless, because we do have wiring that's protective. I wouldn't call it socialized sense of fear, but or even ideas of fear. But there are things that do cause that to happen that are programmed to protect our organism, our body, to encourage our safety and survivability, and those are important things. But at the just processing level, there are sometimes that there are subtle cues that kiddos pay attention to, animals pay attention to the same, that they may be able to pay attention to those things that otherwise we think that we were hiding. And often when we're dealing with somebody that's more socialized, somebody that's older, an adult in particular, we tend to forget those subtleties that even though that we're trying to hide, the little ones still see through it because they're not buying into that egotistical crap, supposedly, that we call our self-image. And I say that jokingly, not that our images of self are crap, but in the sense that they're looking at you and they're seeing the real you, the way you are, not the way you want the world to perceive you or to think about you. And that's a very humbling thing, but it's also a very lovely thing to have, and that's especially helpful whenever we deal with stress and whenever we see our kiddos in stress. There are things that are hard to explain and put words to, but if we understand that often our stresses and our fears and our worries and our anxieties start at the body level, that gives us a little time, a little distance and patience uh, from what's going on, in the sense that we don't feel like it's personal, we don't take it personally. And we're more apt to be helpful if we need to redirect. But also, it allows us to have a little compassion and patience with ourselves when we realize that, okay, there's something going on here. And it's not all in my head, and it's not character, it's not ethic, nor moral lack on my part. It's environmental. And this is where we start seeking the answers. Sometimes we have to slow things down to be able to make a difference, especially if we're experiencing stressors that are uncomfortable, or communication or confrontations that don't make us feel particularly good, especially in the social sense. So a very important thing is to note that sometimes we perceive things, some signals, that read what we would call, in some cases, body language. And this isn't just reading body language. That is a higher cognitive process whenever we interpret. But this is the reading of the body language at the survival level that is beyond the, or are they crossing their arms or closed off and all that mess. That's all useful. But this is much deeper and much more powerful in my estimation, as far as reading intentions and feeling safe around people and knowing whether or not we can pick up what I would call intentional motion, whether it's good, bad, or whatever. And the sensitivity is really highly useful and not a bad thing to get reacquainted with. On the heels of this just processing, some theories have come out, and it's a good model. It's a useful model that, for instance, law enforcement and other agencies of that sort have used, and even in sports, they've used this idea to help people understand that whenever we make decisions, whenever we have too many things to pick from, it slows our decision process down and resembles an ambiguity, a frustrating situation. But whenever we do have simpler and fewer choices, we tend to have a higher degree of success at executing whatever it is that we need to do, whether it be pick up a box or go to the store, or if we have to do something in self-defense, run and know what direction to go and which door to go through. That tends to encourage our not only success, but our capacity to succeed at using those tools to decide what's best for me versus going into a default process. So the OODA loop, they call it the OODA loop, and it's an acronym, each one of those representing an aspect of how we act and decide during stress. And the first O of the OODA loop is to observe whatever it is that we take in visually, and that can be tactile, it can also be visual, smell as well. That's information that comes in, or something that tastes bad that can indicate to us something else going on. All of these perceptual, tactile senses would fall under the first O of OODA loop. And the second O has to do with organize. What am I doing with that information that I just take in? So if I organize, that means I make sense of priority. Is it safe? Is it dangerous? Is it useful? Can I do something with this or not? Go on to the next. So organize is the second O of the OODA loop, which is observe and organize. The second O, of course, has to do with making sense of that information we took in. And D, decide. So that's whenever I take that gathered information or perceived information and make a decision whether or not to use that to inform my egress or my leaving that place, or making a decision to use or do something with that information once again. And then finally, A from the OODA loop is to act. That's whenever we finally have observed information, is organized, decided upon it using that info, and informed our action. We're going to leave out that door because that leads outside, not to the bathroom. So therefore, I'm safer if I've got to run from a situation that is potentially dangerous. And why is this important? Well, the OODA loop is just a good acronym to help me look at things with a bit of insight in how I go about doing things. And if you ever use this, just to think about whenever you have done things, what was the information that you observed in the environment? What kicked it off? How did I organize that in the sense of, was it a priority? Was it not? Did I ignore it? Should I not have ignored it? Did I make a mistake? And my decision to do or not to do, the act. And whenever you use that as a template, it gives us some insight, especially if something happened really, really fast. Sometimes you see a breakdown in that observation, organization, decision, and action. Sometimes to decide to act doesn't come out. Things happen too fast that it's faster than my ability to observe, organize, and decide. Maybe I got struck during the time I was still deciding what to do. Maybe I froze because I felt like there wasn't any information, and that's when we start seeing things like the anxiety and the freeze response. And sometimes, if the information is too fast and it feels like I'm in danger, sometimes I may fight, I may physically strike out with little or no information. And whenever I told you about how fast visual information presents, if it's 150 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds, we are still able to organize, decide, and act. Observation, no time at all. It happens, and we take it. But whenever we're faster than 100 milliseconds in presentation, something presents in our visual field fast, and it's looming, meaning that it's getting bigger. From far away, it starts like a little ping pong ball. Next thing is the size of a basketball. That means it's moving at me really fast. If it's growing in my visual field, then I need to either intercept it or I got to duck and dodge, or I'm going to get smacked by it. Whenever things happen at faster than 100 milliseconds, it doesn't matter if somebody is tossing a little teddy bear at you that's all cute and you just want to squeeze it and hug it, versus something that is hard that's being hurled at you like a rock or a bottle or a basketball, volleyball, that sort of thing, or even somebody's hand trying to hit you. If that's what's happening, then we know that we have to get out of the way. We're going to, if it presents at 100 milliseconds or less, determined to be dangerous. We're going to treat it as a negative. We're going to look at it in the sense that it's potentially dangerous. And it could be somebody you know, it could be a friend. Somebody pops out from the side of a door that's too fast. You may smack them, not meaning to. This does not justify violence, but all I'm telling you is that if it's too fast, faster than 100 milliseconds, the 150 to 300 millisecond range still preserves our capacity to decide and determine, can I approach it, can I avoid it, is it friend or foe? If it's friendly, I can still stop myself. That's incredibly fast. But by the time our thinker comes on at 1.2 seconds, that's 400 times slower than the 150 to 300 millisecond range. That still preserves some ability to think and decide that we may be able to get away with not harming somebody or something. But if it's faster than 100 milliseconds, we will by default treat it like it's dangerous to us. And it's a self-preservation, and it doesn't matter if it's friendly, it's too fast. We have to treat it that way because that's what our wiring would predict, as something moving that fast could be potentially dangerous to us. So that's an insight that most people aren't aware of with this OODA loop. It does work, but depending on speed of presentation, we can make errors in our response. Often in the military, we hear of friendly firefights, friendly fire death, rather. Same thing with the police, wherever somebody pops out and they don't have enough time and they have something that they have to determine is dangerous, the toy gun. And this isn't speaking badly of law enforcement. This is just speaking of the situation as it is factually, not to the benefit of anyone if they're jumping out at you at that speed. The next portion of what we're going to be discussing right now has to do with gross motor dominance and fine motor degradation. These have to do with how our physical body responds under stress. Mind you, we're still talking about the OODA loop and also just processing how we're perceiving things in our environment. But whenever things get very stressful, heart rate goes up, breathing changes, blood flow goes to the muscles, we get a lot stronger. We're not as smart. We don't have to be smart and be able to do calculus when we're running, fighting, or jumping. But we do have to be stronger and more physically capable. And that is what we're focused on right now, is the fact that by default, that means we're not choosing this. It chooses us by virtue of the stress and also the increase in the heart rate and the breathing, as if we're supposed to be in physical action, especially if we're trying to avoid danger. That means that whenever you're gross motor dominant, that means you lose a little physical grace. We lose some of our fine motor skill. Whereas before we're able to pick up pennies and nickels and little tiny things off the table with our fingertips, we now feel very ham-handed, very clumsy sometimes, trying to do small things. I used to work as an optician years ago, and the precision screwdrivers I eventually learned how to use. I never thought I could. I always felt a bit clumsy, but later I realized that I was able to use that. Of course, I wasn't using it whenever my heart rate was really high, but still, the differentiation of a fine motor skill, like using a precision screwdriver for tiny little screws on a set of glasses versus something that you would do like undoing a nut on a tire whenever you're using a tire iron. That's gross motor, very muscular, but much larger, but in comparison, very similar. So why is gross motor dominance something we need to pay attention to? I'll tell you why. One of the reasons is that often whenever we're in domestic situations, such as with our kiddos, with our family, not violence necessarily, but rather when things get stressful, our blood flow shunts to our muscles once again, and it gets a little hard, and sometimes we may even raise our voice and get a little physically intimidating. Maybe not meaning to. The intention is to control the situation, but we may over-respond not meaning to. How can I tell if I'm in gross motor dominance? How can I tell if I see somebody else that's in gross motor dominance? Often when somebody is stressed or somebody has been lifting weights, and I do this with club bells and kettlebells, for instance, and I note this with myself and also with my sons, that whenever they've been physically active and they were physically running, if they're trying to navigate through the front door and go through the living room, they tend to bump into corners and doors, and they bump into kitchen tables and whatnot, not meaning to, but they're not only the perception's off, but their motion is much bigger because they were doing big movements. They're not as graceful and they tend to trip on things, especially if they were particularly active moments before. Now, it takes a little time, and you'll note that whenever they're a little calmer, those things might happen, but not nearly as much or with as great intensity as whenever they were experiencing a high heart rate, this sort of thing. But something to pay attention to. And it's not always kids going through the clumsy stage. And yes, we do go through that. I kind of say that jokingly because I experienced that. Probably broke every Star Wars glass set that my mother had gotten for us when we were kids as a result of the glass just falling out of my hand. Not because I was being clumsy. I just, for some reason, didn't have control. But the awkward stage, yes, we do go through that. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about. So what I am saying is that often whenever we're physically active, doing things that are very large, gross motor, skeletal muscle movements, we tend to be a little more clumsy for a little bit. We also have a little bit of degradation or fine motor skill, not being able to do the precision screwdriver thing or the little tiny thing, sewing, needlepoint. You probably don't want to do that till you cool down and your heart rate isn't pumping hard, because then the very pulse that you have pulsing through you at a higher rate will actually be making you move your hand. And you'll note when you hold something small like a pen or a needle or even a paper clip that the pulse will be shaking what it is you're trying to hold with your fingertips. So our fine motor capacity starts to degrade temporarily until things cool down. But just some important symptoms to pay attention to. Why am I telling you this once again? If you have kiddos and if you want them to settle down and talk to you, maybe we need to let them cool down their heart rate so that way they're in their fullest capacity so the message gets through. I know as a parent sometimes things are very prioritized based on need And sometimes you have to jump in and tell them and redirect them quickly. And that's understandable. But this is just something that's useful and helpful, not just as a parent, but as an individual, regulating yourself and being easy on ourselves and realize that the body changes based on the environmental stress and also the heart rate and the cardiovascular stress we put ourselves under. And these are things having to do with exercise that we try to do for what? To increase not just heart rate variability, but our resilience. If we're physically able to change heart rate and then go back from high to low and baseline, then that's incredible. That's good. We don't want it to just be always peak with every little stress. We want it to match the stress. We don't want it to over respond and everything is overwhelming, anxious, painful, and uncomfortable. So this also ties into the resilience that we build by becoming more fit as much as we can. Fit does not mean athletic, so please don't take that incorrectly. Becoming more fit means that we're able to manage and accommodate, I don't want to say cope, but accommodate the stresses in our environment because living a life is stressful. And not all stress is bad. It'd be nice if all stress was good. Well, maybe not, because we wouldn't be able to tell when it was good or even when it was bad. So we should be grateful for the stresses in our lives sometimes, not the pain, not the discomfort or the dysphoric, but rather the stresses that cause us to change and encourage us to adapt to our environment because the most adaptable are the ones who win. This isn't about the misquoted idea that supposedly Darwin put forth about the survival of the fittest. That's not anything he ever said in his writings. It was about the one that is most adaptable, the one that is most capable of shifting and changing and adapting to the environment is the best survivor. And in our lives, our day to day, we are wanting to survive better. We want to adapt better. We want to have not only a more flexible response, but a more healthy, flexible, adaptive response versus maladaptation. That's a lot in a little bit, but these are some useful pointers and tools that can help manage not only sport, but your life, communicating with people, and also might give you some Jedi mind skills to help you read your neighbor. And yes, I did say that, and maybe you're laughing at me a little bit, but don't worry, I'm laughing at you too. Because sometimes we've got to smile a bit and enjoy what it is that we call our lives, even if they have stress in them. So for now, I want to tell you thank you for spending time with me and let me share with you some important points about just processing also the OODA loop, how we absorb, organize, and act, and decide and act, and also the things that come with stress, gross motor dominance, and also degradation of fine motor skill, because these are helpful tools that may help you identify what goes on with us and ourselves under stress, and also our peers and coworkers and neighbors. So for now, follow, like, share, and if you know somebody that could be interested in this podcast, please let them know about it. Send it to them. And if you'd like to send me any messages, of course, you can send any messages to my email at runningmangetskillsproject@gmail.com. And we'll talk to you soon.